where if you move a really big ship in a little bit better of a direction, you're going to do a lot of good. And we want to leave you with a video to sort of have that in the back of your head. And this is about regulation, deregulation in the 1970s, and how much good it ultimately created.
"'Twas 2 nights before Christmas, and all through their houses, every creature was busy double-clicking their mouses. Christmas was coming, but there were still presents to buy. Thank heavens overnight shipping allows boxes to fly. But how can this be, the people asked in their haze? With so many miles to cover, why aren't there delays? What allowed this to happen is a very old rule, that deregulated air cargo. Now isn't that cool? You see, express planes were smaller, unlike today. Bigger is better, but the law said no way. And if fisherman Fred shipped lively lobsters from Maine, he hoped for some room in the belly of a passenger plane. But if Aunt Edna had checked in 15 pieces of luggage, Fred's lobsters would arrive days later, looking quite sluggish. Freed from restrictions, more packages could flow and arrive soon as promised, even in snow. This allowed private carriers to grow and expand, unleashing innovations no one could have planned. With better shipping options, online shopping exploded, and business inventories grew leaner before they were bloated. Thanks to rolling back rules that were surely passé, delivery is almost as fast as Santa's great sleigh.
Keeping that in your back pocket, and we have some great closing comments. Why don't we start with Adam White and go to Matt Spalding, and then we'll wrap it up with Doug Holtz.
Thanks. A couple very small points to reiterate, and then try to finish with a bigger picture. First, the small points. As we stressed in our discussion, regulatory reform and regulatory accountability really depends on, among other things, meaningful judicial review, which in turn requires that you give the courts something to really sort of hang their analysis on, something the courts are equipped to dig into. One is procedures. The courts are good at enforcing procedures when they exist, when the rules exist. The irony, and Daniel Flores and others see this so often, when you do try to impose new procedures on agencies, you'll find the agencies and scholars sympathetic to those agencies complaining that you're making life too burdensome for the regulators. I mean, imagine how the rest of us feel about living under the rules imposed by those regulators. But it's important to impose more procedural standards on them, not so much that you sort of counterproductively push administrative lawmaking underground, that they try to circumvent these procedures, but trying to really impose procedures that'll stick and that'll be enforceable. One thing we didn't say in our panel, but I want to stress, oversight is a very helpful adjunct to, among other things, litigation. The things that folks on the Hill do in terms of fact-finding and investigation, drawing out facts, they're useful not just in the narrative that surrounds litigation, but also they will help give the courts a clearer, more accurate picture of the work that agencies do. I think that some of the reports that have come out on fuel regulation or CAFE, climate change and other things have helped reinforce how politicized the agencies have become. As Boyd and the rest of us stressed, clear statutes are key. Limiting delegations, as Jeff Rosen said, it's key to really keeping the administrative state within boundaries. But my big point, something that we didn't get into on my panel, but I really want to stress, is what an important moment we're in. Jeff, I think, pointed out that the Administrative Procedure Act hasn't been revised since 70 years. I mean, the fact is, for 70 or 80 years, almost everything about the administrative state, how it was structured and how it went about its work, was really locked in from the New Deal. The New Deal set the benchmarks and raised the questions that we spent 80 years answering. I don't think it's an exaggeration, or if it's an exaggeration, it's only a slight one, to say that we're in a similar moment in the last 10 years in terms of how agency structure has changed, changes in how they are accountable or not accountable to Congress in addition to the president. I think you really can't exaggerate how important this is, The next time a new crisis arises and a new agency is created, they won't say make us like the FTC. They'll say make us like the CFPB. I think it's very important that these new paradigms be pushed back against right now, because these are the questions we'll be grappling with for decades. At the same time, my last point is that if anything right now, there are strong pressures in favor of more executive power, not less. I think back to the progressive era, where the centralization of regulatory power, it arose both as a populist movement and as sort of an intellectual movement, and I see both strains happening now. The populist forces that gave rise to, say, the CFPB's creation, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. At the same time, you have intellectuals, people I respect, Francis Fukuyama, Neil Ferguson, John Micklethwaite, John DiIulio, and others, saying that what's broken right now in government is the absence of executive power. There needs to be more executive power, not less. There needs to be less congressional and judicial check and balance, not more. And so I think as we push forward on these issues and seek regulatory accountability, there's obviously populist and intellectual arguments on my side of the argument as well, but I really I can't stress enough that there's going to be there's so much energy on that side of the argument, both in terms of populism and intellectual power, that it requires a very strong argument on my side of the argument.
Thanks, Daniel. These are all very good comments. It's been an excellent conference. I commend you for all of that. The particulars have been raised, have been wonderful. I would just reiterate a few things going back to some of my earlier remarks, but also picking up over the course of your conversations today. I think it's crucially important to recognize this thing for what it is and not get caught up in the weeds, which is very easy to do, especially when you're up here working on the Hill. The distinction between the modern regulatory state, the administrative state, whatever we want to call it, and the broad world of constitutional government, despite the differences between Hamilton and Jefferson and all the great debates they've been having for hundreds of years, that pales in significance when you think about the form of government we are now building up all around us. We need to be able to call that out. We need to be able to describe it for what it is in very common and clear terms. I think of the moment when the various debates before the Civil War became clarified, when a mind like Lincoln's was capable of cutting through the debate and going clearly at the heart of the matter and making a distinction between slavery and freedom. Very simple distinctions. The modern regulatory state is destructive of consent. It's unconstitutional, by which I don't mean, although I include in the technical way, but in a broad way. It really violates our way of governing. And I think we now have before us increasingly an opening to make those kinds of arguments. The minutiae of regulation, when you add that to the expansion of the modern executive's use of those regulations, which will increase as money gets tighter, make that more and more of an opportunity. The fact that there's endless cronyism and opportunities for corruption because of this modern state contributes to that as well. The fact of the matter is that faction, the idea of faction that Madison described in the Federalist Papers, is now before us, which is to say the federal government in these ways have made it into a faction. It is now coming to the point where it now represents its own interests, has its own unions, its own way of doing things, separate from the opinion of the American people. And that thing is coming to the point where it eventually is going to overwhelm us. A couple of practical points. One is I think we need to have this understanding of the thing to help us define and determine what are the best strategic things we should be going after. Right? Politics is about making principled and prudential judgments. But to make those prudential judgments, you got to have a clear understanding of where you're going. So it needs to be informed by this. All the questions about efficiencies, about making the process better, which are very important, and I strongly support, must also be informed by an objective of wanting to undermine the overall objectives of this modern state in order to get back to self-government. There is no silver bullet. That's one thing that becomes obvious when you go through these kinds of conversations. There is no singular silver bullet we should attack on all fronts. Driving back to the legislative branch in terms of putting it into the areas where a political deliberative body can make accommodations and debate these questions. Having a better review process in the judiciary, and trying to assure better execution in the administrative branch. Interestingly, driving back towards the three main functions of constitutional government. So we need to understand the nature of the thing. We need to understand where we're going and how we're proceeding. We need to think boldly and carefully and strategically in a prudential way. And the last point I would make, just behind all of this, is for us to keep in mind another admonition of Lincoln's. Public sentiment is everything. Without it, nothing can succeed. If you can mold public sentiment, you go deeper than statutes and judicial decisions. This issue, it strikes me, is at a point, a certain ripeness, if you will, that we need to think about shaping public opinion on it. That's what's going to make all of these things possible. All the various congressional pieces of legislation we should push on, but they're not going to go through Congress, even this Congress, with this president, in current circumstances. There needs to be a larger movement to make this into a larger argument in the way I described this morning of Winston Churchill's. Just remember, people are easy to lead, but as he said, hard to drive. Thank you.
I want to commend the organizers as well. This is a tremendous affair. I think it's just a really, really useful thing to do. And I would encourage everyone to just walk away from today with the clear recognition that regulation is not something that happens in a silo. It's not something that lawyers do. It's not something that specialists know about. It is part and parcel of economic policymaking. It is another tool for good or evil in that realm. It should be considered on a level playing field when you think about the kinds of things you're trying to accomplish on behalf of the American people. And you should take a broad view of it, a holistic view that has all of those things in it. I would also urge you to think of this as a very special moment. In the budget world, we went for literally over centuries without the congressional counterpart to the Bureau of the Budget and the Office of Management and Budget. And in the mid-'70s, there was a conscious decision made that the Congress should be able to have an independent ability to evaluate and make budget decisions. And the Budget Act of 1974 was what came out of that observation. It was the last law signed by then President Richard Nixon prior to his resignation. And we are at a point where not only should the recognition of the political, the judicial, the economic impacts of regulation be made part of the public discussion, it's also a place where you can do some institution building to allow better execution on the congressional side as well as the administrative side. Last thing I'll leave you with is just two observations prompted by Dino. Number one, I've been at the Council of Economic Advisors twice, and typically it's staffed by people who are on leave from academia, and they come to a Republican administration and it does some horrific thing like impose steel tariffs. I don't know who would do that. And and they say, oh my God, what is wrong with these guys? And I say, look, if you bat 300, you win the National League batting title. If you bat 100 as an economist in Washington, D.C., you go to the Hall of Fame. You are going to lose all the time. And it is ultimately your job to make good policy, good politics. And I would encourage you to remember that. It's not enough to have a good policy. It's got to be good politics. You got to sell it. Lincoln was always right. That's something to remember. And my last observation is, remember what's at stake. When I was 16 years old, it was a federal offense to put an answering machine on your phone. We deregulated telecommunications, and now everybody's walking around with a lot more than an answering machine on their phone. We can produce the greatest things in our future if we get this right. Thank you.